John F. Kennedy served as a Navy lieutenant aboard PT boats in the Pacific Theater, performing several acts of heroism, and is the only U.S. president to have been awarded the Purple Heart. President Kennedy won the 1860 presidential election by a slim margin and entered office at a relatively politically divided time in American history compared to previous U.S. elections. His foreign policy would be the topic of this video and not his domestic policy. With that, let's start in the Caribbean. Upon entering office, the first major foreign policy disaster of the Kennedy administration was the Bay of Pigs invasion, where Kennedy scaled back American support for Cuban exiles, and they were all mostly caught, killed, wounded, or executed in April of 1961 by the Castro regime. Eventually, in 1962, the Kennedy administration negotiated the repatriation of the Cuban exiles to return to the U.S. The Bay of Pigs debacle heightened Cuban-American tensions and would have dire consequences. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world came the closest that it ever did to nuking itself, the Soviets sent nuclear missiles to Cuba, and many of Kennedy's advisors wanted the U.S. to invade Cuba. Kennedy disregarded their advice and followed the advice of former General Douglas MacArthur, who had 3 meetings with Kennedy where MacArthur advised him to use America's Navy and economic power in a blockade, which was renamed a quarantine. Therefore, a state of war did not exist, and the world de-escalated itself. So I guess you could say the reason the world didn't end was because MacArthur gave good advice to Kennedy. As for Latin America, the president adopted the Kennedy Doctrine to contain and reverse communist progress in the Western Hemisphere. Kennedy reaffirmed the United States' pledge to come for the defense of any nation whose independence and democracy was endangered. He promised to increase the Food for Peace emergency program and to provide economic aid to Latin American nations in need. In 1961, the Soviets and East Germans built the Berlin Wall and kicked off the Berlin Crisis at Checkpoint Charlie. Kennedy ordered 500 military men to travel on trucks through East Germany to West Berlin to ensure that the West's preservation of the land-linked city was intact. In late October of 1961, a dispute over the right of one U.S. diplomat to cross East Berlin flared into a conflict. Soviet and American tanks faced off one another at Checkpoint Charlie, but Kennedy, through an intermediacy, offered Khrushchev a conciliatory formula, and both superpowers withdrew their tanks. On June 26, 1963, the president arrived in West Berlin and visited Checkpoint Charlie, where on that day he delivered his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech in front of 150,000 West Germans. Although he despised the Berlin Wall, Kennedy saw the wall as preferable to a war. Additionally, in Europe, Kennedy oversaw the Portugal-U.S. conflict, where the United States opposed Portugal's colonial policies. Until 1972, the U.S. would support African rebels against the Portuguese in various colonial wars. The United States-Portugal relations would remain strained until the Carnation Revolution of 1974, which allowed for them to be repaired. Turning to Asia, the Kennedy administration had American advisors and Green Berets in Vietnam with military and economic support for the South Vietnamese, primarily against the Viet Cong rebels. The 1963 coup occurred, which Kennedy was horrified at, and the South Vietnamese politics is really hard to get through and complicated and full of coups, but eventually Kennedy came around to approving it. Additionally, Douglas MacArthur had advised Kennedy to not escalate the war in Vietnam, and of course MacArthur bashed on Kennedy's advisors. As for China, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was unsure of how the Sino-Soviet split would affect Chinese international affairs. Afterwards, however, China was very militant on the global stage. Mao deliberately made the United States a highly visible enemy and focused even more hostility against India to the point of launching the Sino-Indian War. The United States supported India, ignoring India's long-standing commitment to Moscow, and India realized that it needed American financial help and munitions, so Prime Minister Nehru in August of 1963 wrote to Kennedy explaining the challenges that India faced from China and Pakistan. Nehru indicated in his agreement with the American position when he warned that the Chinese were inciting global militant, aggressive, and revolutionary behavior in Africa, Latin America, and Asia as China was competing with the Soviets. Iraq was a very crazy powder keg of political violence throughout the 60s. A coup had occurred in 1958 where General Qasem killed the royal family and created a socialist state. Then in 1963 there were 2 separate coups. One was in February where the Baathists staged the Ramadan Revolution, and the other one was in November where the Nasserists overthrew the Baathists. Kennedy pretty much stayed out of it and preferred the Baathists over the socialists because of Cold War politics, yet he preferred Nasserist neutrality over Baathist extremism. The First Iraqi-Kurdish War was also going on in Iraq during this time, lasting from 1961 to 1970. During this time, the Kennedy administration was sympathetic to the Kurds throughout the war and was alleged to have been supplying the Kurds along with Israel and Iran. However, Kennedy's administration had also provided weapons to the Iraqi government from 1963, mostly to deal with the ongoing political crisis within Iraq, but also provided some napalm for the war. Kennedy would also support ceasefires between both factions, as America's main enemy in Iraq was communism. During the Congo crisis, which began in 1960, the Katanga breakaway state was formed in the south under the rule of Moise Tshombe, while other parts of the Congo were pure chaos. On October 2, 1962, Kennedy signed the United Nations Bond Issue Bill to ensure American assistance in financing the United Nations peacekeeping operations in the Congo and elsewhere. Around this time, the Kennedy administration was also privately making attempts to convince Tshombe to reunite the breakaway Katanga state that had left the Congo, in advance of the United Nations intervention. But starting in 1963, the Soviet, Chinese, and Cuban-backed Kwilu and Simba rebels started massacring people all throughout the Congo, and the US intervened in support of Belgium, the UN, and the Congolese state. Since this is the Cold War, Kennedy was fearful of the possibility of a global nuclear war, and he implemented a new strategy known as a flexible response. This strategy relied on conventional arms to achieve limited goals. As part of this policy, Kennedy expanded the United States Special Operations Forces, elite military units, and other unconventional fighting forces in various conflicts. Kennedy hoped that the flexible response strategy would allow for the U.S. to counter Soviet influence without resorting to war. At the same time, he ordered massive buildups of the nuclear arsenals to establish superiority over the Soviet Union. Regarding arms control, though, President Kennedy signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 to outlaw nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. But after President Kennedy's untimely assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson would assume the office of the presidency, and he wouldn't exactly have the same worldview as President Kennedy, but that will be a story for another video. What did you think of President Kennedy's foreign policy? Although he did not even fulfill an entire term in office, he still had a very impactful foreign policy. And of course, like every president, he made decisions without hindsight and sometimes with incomplete information. But let me know in the comments what you thought of it. Then thank you for watching.